Welcome to Silent Kingdoms. Tonight, we travel east. Far beyond familiar roads and ancient capitals, toward islands resting quietly beneath drifting clouds and moonlit seas. Before emperors, before samurai, before great castles and crowded cities, there was only water, volcanic mountains, deep forests, and the patient rhythm of waves touching distant shores. And perhaps that is where every history truly begins, not with kings or battles, but with landscape, with silence. If you are listening from somewhere beneath tonight's sky, perhaps while rain touches your window, or while the world around you grows quieter, tell us gently in the comments where you have joined this journey from, and what hour the night has reached where you are. And if these peaceful travels through history bring you comfort, your support helps Silent Kingdoms continue its quiet journey toward 1,000 companions. Now, allow the day to drift away, and together we begin. Long before the word Japan existed, before maps carried familiar borders, the islands we now call Japan were still forming. This story begins not in palaces, but in fire. Japan rests along the edge of powerful tectonic boundaries, a meeting place of restless geological forces beneath the sea. Over immense stretches of time, volcanic activity and shifting plates shaped chains of islands rising from ocean waters. The land itself was born through movement. Mountains emerged, coastlines changed, and earthquakes, still part of Japanese life today, became woven into the natural character of these islands. To ancient people, such landscapes must have felt alive, not merely scenery, but presence. Dense forests covered much of the land. Mist gathered over valleys. Hot springs emerged from beneath volcanic ground, and towering mountains stood beneath changing skies. Among them, one mountain would later become especially sacred: Mount Fuji. Though its familiar symbolic place belongs to later centuries, the mountain itself had already watched over the islands for ages beyond memory. Tonight, we imagine these early landscapes carefully. Not yet a nation, not yet united, only islands stretching across the Pacific. The four great islands we know today, Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku, formed part of a wider archipelago containing thousands of smaller islands as well. Their position mattered greatly, close enough to mainland Asia for ideas and migration, yet separated by sea. And seas can do something remarkable. They connect and protect at the same time. During colder Ice Age periods, lower sea levels occasionally created easier migration routes. Animals moved, and eventually, humans arrived. The earliest human presence in Japan reaches back many thousands of years. Archaeological evidence suggests people lived across these islands long before recorded history. Their world was demanding, but also rich. Forests offered resources. Coastlines provided fish and shellfish. Rivers carried life inland. And unlike some harsher environments, the islands supported remarkably diverse ecosystems. These early inhabitants lived without written chronicles. No kings recorded their victories. No historians described their names. Yet traces remain. Stone tools, settlement remains, fragments of daily life quietly preserved beneath earth and time. And perhaps this is worth remembering. History does not begin only when writing appears. People lived entire lives before written memory. They loved, worked, raised families, watched seasons pass, and listened to winds moving through forests much like we might imagine tonight. The climate itself changed repeatedly. Warmer periods encouraged settlement. Coastal regions became especially important. And gradually, communities developed their own rhythms of life. The islands shaped those rhythms. Isolation between regions often encouraged local identities. Mountains separated valleys. Forests limited movement. And travel remained slow. For long stretches of early history, communities lived somewhat apart from one another. This mattered, because geography would continue shaping Japanese history for centuries. The sea protected, the mountains divided, and nature remained impossible to ignore. Even much later, Japanese religion, art, and philosophy would carry deep respect for natural forces. Perhaps these values began here, in landscapes that inspired awe and caution alike. Yet while the islands offered beauty, they also carried danger. Volcanoes, storms, earthquakes, tsunamis. Nature could nourish and suddenly destroy. To survive in such environments required adaptation, observation, patience, and cooperation. The earliest communities learned these lessons long before cities appeared, and over many generations, they developed cultures uniquely tied to island life. Still, the story of Japan had not yet fully begun. Not as a kingdom, not as a state, only as scattered worlds connected by water and memory. But change was coming, slowly, quietly, through people who lived close to forests and coastlines, leaving behind mysterious traces that archaeologists would one day uncover. They belonged to one of Japan's earliest known cultures, a people whose pottery would survive thousands of years beneath the soil. And with them, the islands began speaking more clearly. The Jomon world was waiting to emerge. The islands rested beneath changing skies. Forests stretched across valleys. Waves met rocky shores with patient rhythm. And long before emperors or samurai entered memory, the people of Japan were already building lives deeply connected to nature. Tonight, we travel into one of the oldest chapters of Japanese history, a world without castles, without written records, without kings whose names survived, yet not without culture, not without beauty, and certainly not without intelligence. Archaeologists call this period the Jomon Age. The name comes from a simple but remarkable detail. Jomon means cord-marked, because the pottery left behind by these early people often carried rope-like patterns pressed into clay. It is a quiet kind of legacy, not carved monuments, but fingerprints of daily life. The Jomon period began thousands of years ago, reaching back to roughly 14,000 BCE. To place this in perspective, the pyramids of Egypt still lay far in the future. Most civilizations familiar to us had not yet appeared. And yet, across the Japanese islands, people already lived in surprisingly stable communities. The world of the Jomon was not primitive in the careless way older histories sometimes suggested. They were hunters, gatherers, fishers, but many lived in semi-settled villages for long periods. Japan's natural environment made this possible. Forests provided nuts and game. Rivers carried fish. Coastal waters supplied shellfish and marine life. Food sources were varied, and this diversity allowed communities to remain relatively stable. Tonight, we imagine a Jomon village. Circular pit houses partially built into the earth. Smoke drifting upward from hearth fires. Children moving between homes. Fishing tools drying near shorelines. And forests surrounding everything like living walls. Life required labor, but also knowledge. Seasonal patterns mattered deeply. People understood migration routes, plant cycles, weather, and the changing moods of the sea. Their world moved with nature rather than against it. Among the most fascinating Jomon discoveries are the pottery vessels themselves. Some are astonishingly old, among the oldest known pottery in human history. Imagine that for a moment. Hands shaping clay beside ancient fires, thousands of years before written history would remember these islands. The pottery could be practical, storage vessels, cooking containers, but some pieces appear almost artistic, decorated with swirling designs and dramatic forms. Even in distant ages, beauty mattered. The Jomon also created small figurines called dogu. Their meaning remains partly mysterious. Some appear human, others almost dreamlike, perhaps connected to ritual, fertility, or spiritual belief. We cannot know every answer, and perhaps that uncertainty makes them even more intriguing. Because history is not only what we know, it is also what remains hidden. Religion during this period likely centered around natural forces and spiritual presence. Mountains, animals, water. The living environment itself may have carried sacred meaning. Later Japanese spirituality, especially Shinto, would preserve deep respect for nature and unseen spirits called kami. Though direct connections remain debated, the emotional roots may stretch far into these early centuries. Yet history never remains still, and over time, new influences approached the islands. Across the sea, mainland Asia was changing. Agriculture spread, technologies advanced, and migration carried new knowledge. Around the first millennium BCE, another great transformation began. Historians call it the Yayoi period. The Yayoi world differed significantly from the Jomon, not through sudden replacement alone, but through gradual change and interaction. People arrived carrying new practices. Among the most important, wet rice agriculture. Rice cultivation transformed life. It encouraged more organized farming, more permanent settlements, population growth, and increasingly structured societies. Rice was not merely food, it shaped labor, seasonal rhythms, cooperation, and eventually power itself. Because when agriculture expands, leadership often becomes more necessary. The Yayoi also brought new technologies. Metalworking appeared. Bronze and iron tools spread. Weapons changed. Farming became more efficient, and villages increasingly reflected social differences. Not everyone possessed equal status. Some communities accumulated wealth and influence. The islands were changing, quietly but permanently. Chinese historical records from this period offer some of the earliest written references to people living in Japan. To Chinese observers, the islands contained many separate communities and local rulers. Not one nation, but many. One account describes a land called Wa, a place of numerous chiefdoms scattered across the islands. And among these chiefdoms, one mysterious figure emerges from early history. A woman, a ruler remembered through distant records. Her name was Queen Himiko. Tonight, we leave her story waiting at the edge of the firelight, because her appearance marks something important. The moment when Japan begins moving not only through archaeology, but into recorded history itself. And with Himiko, the age of scattered communities would slowly begin turning towards something larger. Night settled softly across the islands. Rice fields reflected pale moonlight, mist gathered along rivers and forest edges, and as the Yayoi world matured, Japan slowly moved closer to recorded history. For thousands of years, the people of these islands had lived without written chronicles. Their voices survived through pottery, tools, and traces beneath the earth. But now, distant observers began writing about them, and with writing, history gains names. Chinese records from the 3rd century CE describe the islands as a land of many communities, not yet united, not governed by one throne. Instead, dozens of regional chiefdoms existed across the archipelago. Some traded, some competed, and like many early societies, alliances shifted with time. To Chinese diplomats and historians, this land was called Wa, and among these scattered chiefdoms, one ruler stood apart. A queen, a priestess, a figure surrounded by mystery. Her name was Himiko. Tonight, we meet her through fragments, because much about Himiko remains uncertain. No portrait survives, no diary, no palace standing untouched, only distant descriptions and centuries of memory. Yet sometimes fragments are enough. According to Chinese chronicles, Himiko ruled over a polity called Yamato. Its exact location remains debated even today. Some scholars place it in northern Kyushu. Others argue for the Nara region. History occasionally leaves such questions unresolved, and perhaps that uncertainty keeps curiosity alive. What fascinated Chinese observers most was not only Himiko's authority, but the manner of her rule. They described her as a spiritual leader, a woman associated with ritual and divination, someone who rarely appeared publicly, attended by servants, communicating through intermediaries. The descriptions carry an almost dreamlike quality, part ruler, part sacred figure. The records also suggest that Himiko emerged during conflict among rival groups. Violence and instability had troubled the land, and her leadership perhaps offered order. A reminder that power in early societies often depended not only on force, but on belief. People follow leaders for many reasons: fear, respect, tradition, and sometimes hope for peace. Whether every detail of these accounts is accurate remains debated. Ancient writers viewed foreign societies through their own assumptions. Still, Himiko's story matters deeply because she represents one of the earliest recognizable political figures in Japanese history. And her era reveals something important. The islands were changing. Agriculture supported larger populations. Leadership grew more organized. Social hierarchies became clearer, and regional powers expanded. This gradual transformation led toward a new age. Historians call it the Kofun period. The name comes from one of its most striking features: gigantic burial mounds. Across parts of Japan, rulers and elites constructed enormous tombs, some shaped like keys when viewed from above, surrounded by moats, rising quietly from the landscape. Even today, these kofun remain among Japan's most remarkable ancient structures. They suggest authority becoming more centralized. Because monuments of such scale require labor, coordination, and organized power. Tonight, imagine one beneath fading evening light. Workers carrying earth, leaders overseeing construction, ceremonial objects prepared for burial, and beneath the soil, someone important entering memory. Among these tombs, some are associated with rulers linked to a growing political center, a region known as Yamato. Located in what is now the Nara Basin, Yamato gradually gained influence over neighboring groups. This was not instant unification, nor a sudden empire. History moves more patiently than that. Instead, Yamato expanded through alliances, marriage, ritual prestige, and military strength. Power gathered slowly, like water filling a basin. The rulers of Yamato claimed sacred legitimacy, and here we begin approaching one of the deepest foundations of Japanese identity, the imperial tradition. Later chronicles, especially the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, would trace imperial ancestry to divine origins, particularly to the sun goddess Amaterasu. These texts were written centuries later and combine mythology with history. Yet myths themselves hold meaning, not always as literal fact, but as expressions of identity. Stories explaining who people believe themselves to be. In Japanese tradition, the emperor's lineage became linked to sacred continuity, a bridge between heaven and earth. And this belief would shape political culture for centuries. Meanwhile, the Yamato rulers increasingly interacted with mainland Asia. This mattered enormously, because across the sea, powerful civilizations flourished. China, the Korean kingdoms, centers of writing, government, religion, and technology. Ideas traveled with merchants, diplomats, and migrants, and Japan watched carefully. The islands remained distinct, yet never entirely isolated. Soon, influences from the continent would reshape Japanese society in profound ways. Writing systems, political ideas, architecture, philosophy, and perhaps most transformative of all, a religion arriving from abroad. A faith whose temples and teachings would alter Japan forever. Buddhism was approaching the islands, and with it, Japan would enter an age of cultural awakening unlike anything before. Morning mist drifted gently through valleys. Temple bells had not yet entered the soundscape of Japan. Great wooden pagodas still waited in the future. And yet, across the sea, ideas were already moving. The Yamato rulers had begun gathering authority. Their influence stretched carefully across parts of the islands, not through complete control, but through growing prestige. And as power matured, the rulers of Japan looked outward, toward the mainland, toward civilizations whose traditions reached deep into written history. The seas surrounding Japan had never been walls alone. They protected, but they also carried knowledge. From the Korean kingdoms and China came technologies, diplomacy, and systems of thought that would reshape Japan profoundly. Perhaps the most transformative arrival of all was Buddhism. Tradition often dates its official introduction to the 6th century. According to later records, Buddhist images and texts arrived through the Korean kingdom of Baekje. To us today, this may sound like the arrival of a religion, but to people of the time, it was something larger, a doorway into a sophisticated world. Buddhism came with philosophy, art, literacy, architecture, and new ideas about suffering, morality, and existence. Its arrival, however, was not universally welcomed. New ideas rarely are. Within the Yamato court, powerful clans debated what role Buddhism should play. Some feared foreign influence. Others saw opportunity. Among these competing families, two became especially important. The Soga clan supported Buddhism. The Mononobe clan resisted it. Their disagreement was not only religious, it was political, because belief and power often travel together. Accepting Buddhism could also mean accepting closer engagement with continental civilization. And so, conflict emerged, not merely between faiths, but between visions of Japan's future. Eventually, the Soga gained the upper hand, and with their rise, Buddhism secured stronger footing within the court. Yet perhaps the most influential figure of this era was not a clan leader alone, but a prince. A man remembered with admiration across Japanese history, Prince Shotoku. Tonight, we meet him not as legend, but as a thoughtful reformer. Born in 574 CE, Shotoku served as regent and advisor during a period of transformation. History remembers him as intelligent, curious, and deeply interested in governance and philosophy. Whether every achievement later credited to him belongs entirely to history or partly to memory remains debated. But his symbolic importance is undeniable. Shotoku supported Buddhism strongly. He sponsored temples, encouraged learning, and promoted engagement with Chinese political ideas. Under his influence, Japan increasingly adopted aspects of continental administration. One of the most famous documents associated with him is the 17-article Constitution. Despite the modern word constitution, this was not a constitution in the contemporary sense. Instead, it offered moral and political guidance, harmony, duty, respect for authority, and ethical governance. Confucian ideas mixed with Buddhist values. The message was clear. Order mattered, responsibility mattered, and rulers should govern wisely. These ideas reflected a broader transformation. Japan was moving beyond loose regional leadership toward more structured government. The court sought legitimacy, administration became more organized, and writing gained importance. Chinese characters, kanji, entered Japanese life. This development changed everything, because writing preserves memory. Laws could be recorded, diplomacy conducted, history documented, poetry written. The spoken word gained permanence. Meanwhile, Buddhist architecture transformed landscapes. Temples rose. Wooden structures with elegant roofs appeared beside older sacred places. Perhaps the most famous surviving example from this early age is Horyuji. Its buildings still stand today, among the world's oldest surviving wooden structures. Imagine visiting such a place in the early centuries. The scent of cedar, soft footsteps on wood, monks studying sutras, lantern light moving quietly beneath carved beams. For many people, Buddhism did not replace earlier beliefs entirely. Instead, coexistence emerged. Older traditions centered around nature and kami continued. What we now call Shinto remained woven into daily life. And rather than destroying one another, the two traditions often blended. This coexistence became one of Japan's most distinctive spiritual features. A person might honor kami and also visit Buddhist temples. The sacred world grew larger rather than narrower. Meanwhile, political authority continued consolidating. Inspired partly by Chinese models, court leaders sought stronger central control. And in 645 CE, a major political shift occurred: the Taika reforms. Their goal was ambitious: to strengthen imperial rule, land systems, taxation, administration. The rulers of Japan increasingly imagined themselves not merely as regional leaders, but as heads of a more unified state. This process remained incomplete, but direction mattered, and the direction was clear. By the 8th century, new capitals emerged, planned cities inspired by Chinese models. Government institutions expanded, and Japan entered a remarkable period of state building. The court now possessed greater confidence. Its rulers no longer governed scattered chiefdoms alone. They presided over something increasingly recognizable: an early Japanese state. And with stronger government came new ambition, new ceremony, new beauty. Soon, the capital would move again, to a city of elegant courts and quiet refinement, a place where poetry, silk robes, and moonlit gardens shaped elite life. An age remembered not for conquest alone, but for culture. The Heian world was beginning to bloom. The sound of temple bells now belonged to the islands. Buddhist teachings had found their place beside older spiritual traditions. Government had grown more organized, and the imperial court, increasingly confident, looked toward a future shaped not only by power, but by refinement. Tonight, we enter one of the most beautiful chapters of Japanese history, a world of poetry and perfume, moonlit gardens and painted screens, silk robes moving softly through palace corridors, the age known as Heian Japan. In 794 CE, the imperial capital moved to a new city, Heian Kyo, the city we know today as Kyoto. Its design reflected Chinese influence: broad avenues, ordered streets, formal government districts. Yet over time, the city developed its own distinctly Japanese character. Surrounded by mountains, Kyoto possessed a quiet elegance. Mist drifted over nearby hills. Seasonal colors transformed gardens, and within palace walls, court life unfolded with careful ceremony. For the aristocracy, appearance mattered greatly. Not vanity alone, but sensitivity, taste, and emotional refinement. Clothing carried meaning. Court robes layered in carefully chosen colors. Perfumes were blended to create personal identity. Calligraphy revealed education and grace. Even the manner in which one folded a letter could shape reputation. The Heian court valued something difficult to translate fully: an awareness of beauty and impermanence, a sensitivity to fleeting moments, cherry blossoms falling, moonlight touching water, autumn leaves drifting through wind. These images would later become deeply associated with Japanese aesthetics, but many of their roots grew here. Tonight, imagine entering a Heian palace, lantern light reflecting across polished floors, sliding screens painted with landscapes, nobles exchanging poems rather than speaking openly, music from string instruments lingering through evening air. The pace of life at court could feel distant from ordinary society, yet culturally, its influence proved immense. This became an age of literature, and among the voices emerging from Heian Japan, one remains extraordinary. A woman, a writer, a careful observer of human emotion. Her name was Murasaki Shikibu. Around the early 11th century, she wrote what many scholars consider the world's first great novel, The Tale of Genji. Not merely a story, but a subtle exploration of love, longing, status, and impermanence. Its characters moved through palace life with emotional complexity rare for its age. Even now, more than 1,000 years later, the work still feels remarkably human. Another court writer, Sei Shonagon, created the Pillow Book, a collection of observations and reflections. Sharp, elegant, sometimes playful, sometimes deeply personal. Through such works, we glimpse the emotional texture of Heian life, not only politics, but feelings. And perhaps that is why the period continues to fascinate. Yet, while court culture flourished, the wider country followed different rhythms. Outside Kyoto, farmers worked fields, provincial leaders governed distant regions, and gradually, political realities began shifting, because elegance does not guarantee stability. The imperial court possessed prestige, but prestige and control are not always the same. Over generations, powerful noble families accumulated influence. Among them, one stood above the rest, the Fujiwara clan. Through strategic marriages and political skill, the Fujiwara gained remarkable power within the court. Emperors remained sacred symbols, yet practical authority increasingly passed into aristocratic networks. The Fujiwara often ruled through regency, guiding government while preserving imperial legitimacy. Their dominance shaped Heian politics for centuries. But beneath this refined order, challenges gathered quietly. The farther one traveled from Kyoto, the less direct court control often became. Provincial regions developed their own power structures. Landholding expanded. Local elites strengthened. And with wealth came the need for protection. Armed groups emerged. At first, not yet the legendary warriors of later memory, but the foundations had appeared. Men trained to defend land and loyalty. Families skilled in warfare. The beginning of something new. The Heian court preferred poetry to battle, ceremony to violence. But history does not always follow the preferences of courts. And gradually, the balance between cultural prestige and military power shifted. Two warrior families would soon dominate this changing landscape: the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry would transform Japan forever. Because while Kyoto still admired moonlight and music, the age of warriors was quietly approaching. And soon, the sound of armor would enter the story of Japan. Kyoto still glowed beneath lantern light. Poems were exchanged in elegant handwriting. Cherry blossoms drifted across quiet gardens. And within the imperial court, refinement remained a kind of power. Yet beyond palace walls, another form of power was growing. Not painted on silk screens, not written in poetry, but carried on horseback and sharpened in steel. Tonight, we enter the world of the samurai. The word itself comes from a verb meaning to serve. And in their earliest form, samurai were exactly that: servants of powerful families, warriors tied by loyalty to local lords. But history often transforms servants into rulers, and Japan was moving toward such a transformation. During the late Heian period, the imperial government struggled to maintain firm control over distant provinces. Japan's geography complicated administration. Mountains divided regions, travel remained difficult, and communication moved slowly. Local landowners increasingly relied upon private protection. Power became more regional, more personal, and more military. These armed groups evolved gradually, not overnight. Families trained sons in horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and battlefield discipline. Honor and loyalty became central values. Though later romantic images would shape samurai legend, early warriors lived within practical realities. They defended territory, protected alliances, and navigated uncertain politics. Among the growing warrior families, two clans emerged with particular strength: the Taira and the Minamoto. Tonight, imagine Japan not as one unified authority, but as overlapping loyalties. The emperor still ruled symbolically. The court remained culturally prestigious. But military families increasingly shaped events behind the scenes. The Taira clan rose first. Under Taira no Kiyomori, they achieved extraordinary influence during the 12th century. Kiyomori was ambitious, capable, and politically skilled. He secured high court positions and connected military authority with aristocratic power. For a time, the Taira appeared nearly untouchable. Yet rapid power often creates resentment. Rival families watched carefully, and among them, the Minamoto waited. Conflict between these clans eventually erupted into one of Japan's defining struggles, the Genpei War. Beginning in 1180, this conflict unfolded across several years. Not merely a struggle between individuals, but between competing visions of authority. The fighting brought movement and uncertainty, castles and fortifications, armies traveling across mountains and rivers, alliances shifting. And throughout these campaigns, the role of the warrior expanded. The samurai were no longer regional defenders alone. They had become central political actors. Among the Minamoto leaders, one name would reshape Japanese history profoundly: Minamoto no Yoritomo. Tonight, we should imagine Yoritomo carefully, not as myth, but as strategist. His early life carried hardship. His family suffered during political conflict. He spent years in exile. Yet exile sometimes sharpens patience, and patience can become power. As the Genpei War continued, Yoritomo built alliances carefully. Meanwhile, another Minamoto figure gained legendary fame: his younger brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune remains one of Japan's most beloved historical heroes. Brilliant in battle, charismatic, and later surrounded by folklore and dramatic retellings. Stories portray him as daring and gifted, almost larger than life. Whether every tale reflects history precisely matters less than what they reveal emotionally. Japan remembered Yoshitsune not merely as commander, but as tragic hero. The conflict reached its decisive conclusion in 1185, at the Battle of Dan no Ura. Tonight, imagine the sea itself entering history. Warships moving through narrow waters, arrows crossing open air, tides shaping battle. The Taira and Minamoto confronting one another amid waves and uncertainty. The battle ended in Minamoto victory, and with that victory, an era closed. The Taira fell, their influence collapsed, and political power shifted decisively. Yet perhaps the most important consequence came afterward, because Yoritomo understood something clearly. Military victory alone does not secure lasting authority. Institutions matter. Administration matters. And so, rather than rule solely through Kyoto's imperial court, he established something new: a military government, the Kamakura shogunate. Founded in 1192, its center stood not in Kyoto, but in Kamakura, far from the old aristocratic world. This marked a profound change. The emperor remained. Sacred legitimacy endured. But practical authority increasingly belonged elsewhere, to the shogun. The title itself had earlier origins, yet under Yoritomo it gained unprecedented significance. Japan now possessed dual structures: imperial tradition and military rule. This arrangement would shape centuries of history. The age of court aristocrats had not disappeared, but it no longer stood alone. The age of warriors had begun, and with it, Japan entered a world of discipline, loyalty, and conflict unlike anything before. Still, the samurai age would face trials almost immediately, because beyond the sea, another empire was expanding. An empire whose cavalry had already crossed vast continents. An empire feared from Europe to China. And one day, its gaze would turn toward Japan. The Mongols were coming. The sea surrounding Japan had long been both companion and guardian. It carried merchants, ideas, pilgrims, and distant influence. Yet seas can also carry fear. By the 13th century, the world beyond Japan was changing with astonishing speed. Across the vast plains of Asia, an empire had risen unlike any before. Horsemen crossed enormous distances, kingdoms fell, cities surrendered, and news of this power traveled far ahead of its armies. This was the Mongol Empire. Founded by Genghis Khan and expanded by his descendants, it stretched across continents. From China to Persia, from Central Asia toward Europe, Mongol authority reshaped the medieval world. To many societies, the empire seemed unstoppable, and eventually, its attention moved eastward, toward Japan. At this time, Japan remained under the Kamakura shogunate. The emperor still occupied his sacred place in Kyoto, but real military authority rested with the shogunate and its warrior networks. The samurai order had grown stronger. Loyalty tied retainers to lords. Military administration matured. Yet despite these developments, few could ignore the scale of the Mongol world. The ruler behind this eastern expansion was Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, founder of China's Yuan dynasty. Kublai governed a sophisticated empire and expected neighboring states to acknowledge his authority. Diplomatic envoys reached Japan. Their message carried clear expectation. Submission, recognition of Mongol supremacy, and, perhaps, tribute. The Kamakura leadership faced a difficult decision: accept diplomacy or resist. The response was firm. Japan refused. This refusal carried enormous consequence. Because empires rarely welcome rejection lightly, and so preparations began. Tonight, we imagine the atmosphere of uncertainty spreading across coastal Japan. Samurai gathering intelligence, watch posts scanning the horizon, officials debating strategy, villagers hearing rumors of distant fleets. The year was 1274. The first invasion approached. Mongol-led forces sailed from Korea toward Japan. Their army included Mongols, Chinese, and Korean troops, a multinational force carrying weapons and tactics unfamiliar to many Japanese warriors. The fleets reached Kyushu, and battle followed. To later generations, samurai warfare often appears highly ritualized: single combat, personal honor, formal challenge. But the invading armies fought differently: massed tactics, coordinated formations, explosive projectiles, drums and signals guiding movement. For Japanese defenders, these methods could feel startling. The fighting proved fierce. And yet, history sometimes turns on forces beyond strategy alone. Weather changed, storms developed, and the invading fleet withdrew. Whether because of military difficulties, logistical challenges, or worsening conditions, the invasion ended without conquest. Relief spread. But peace did not return completely, because Kublai Khan had not abandoned his ambitions. 7 years later, another fleet appeared, larger, far larger. The year was 1281. This second invasion became one of the greatest military undertakings of the medieval world. Some estimates describe immense numbers of ships and soldiers. Though medieval figures vary, the scale was undeniable. Japan prepared carefully. Coastal defenses strengthened. Stone walls constructed. Samurai organized resistance. The memory of the first invasion remained fresh. Tonight, imagine long nights beside the shoreline, torches flickering against sea wind, warriors watching dark waters, waiting. The invasion forces arrived. Fighting continued across coastal regions, skirmishes, raids, naval struggle. Neither side achieved easy victory. And once again, nature entered history. A powerful storm struck. Ships damaged, fleets scattered. Chaos spread across the sea. Many vessels were destroyed, and the invasion collapsed. Later generations gave this storm a name: kamikaze, the divine wind. To medieval Japanese society, the meaning felt profound. The islands had survived, protected not only by warriors, but perhaps by divine favor itself. The emotional impact was enormous, and memory transformed the invasions into something larger than military events alone. A story of survival, of sacred protection, of Japan resisting overwhelming force. Yet, history often hides quieter consequences beneath dramatic victories, because the invasions left burdens too. The Kamakura government had mobilized successfully, but defensive war creates challenges. Unlike conquest, there were few lands or rewards to distribute afterward. Samurai had fought, resources had been spent, and many expected compensation. Over time, dissatisfaction grew. The shogunate had survived external threat, but internal tensions quietly increased. Meanwhile, the Mongol world itself changed. The vast empire fragmented over generations, and Japan, protected by sea and distance, continued developing along its own path. But the warrior class had changed forever. The samurai were no longer regional fighters alone. They had defended the nation itself. Their prestige deepened, their identity strengthened, and military power became even more central to political life. Still, victory does not guarantee permanence. The Kamakura order, despite surviving invasion, now faced strains from within, and history carries a familiar rhythm. After external danger passes, internal conflict often follows. Soon, rivalries would rise again, old structures would weaken, and Japan would enter an age remembered not for peace, but for fragmentation. A world of competing warlords, burning castles, and endless ambition. The long age of the shoguns was only beginning. The storms that scattered the Mongol fleets had passed. The shores of Japan grew quiet once more. Fishing boats returned to coastal waters. Temple bells echoed across valleys, and for a time, it may have seemed that the warrior government had secured lasting stability. But history rarely rests for long. Victories can hide weaknesses, and beneath the success of resisting invasion, the Kamakura shogunate faced growing strain. The samurai who had defended Japan expected reward, yet defensive wars offered little land to distribute. No conquered provinces, no vast treasures, only expenses. Over time, debts increased. Some warriors grew dissatisfied, and political tension gathered slowly, like clouds before rain. Meanwhile, power within the shogunate itself became increasingly complex. The descendants of Minamoto no Yoritomo did not retain uncontested authority forever. Instead, another family gradually shaped political control from behind the scenes. The Hojo clan. Acting as regents, the Hojo governed much of Kamakura politics while preserving the formal structure of shogunal rule. This arrangement maintained order for generations. But such systems can become fragile, especially when legitimacy and power no longer rest in the same hands. Far away in Kyoto, the imperial court still remained, ceremonial, ancient, and symbolically powerful. Though military authority dominated government, the emperor's prestige had never disappeared. And eventually, one emperor sought to reclaim more than prestige alone. His name was Emperor Go-Daigo. Tonight, we imagine a ruler dissatisfied with limitation, a man who believed imperial authority should be restored directly, not merely honored, but exercised. In the early 14th century, Go-Daigo challenged the existing order. He opposed the Kamakura regime and sought political renewal. Such ambition carried enormous risk. Conflict followed. At first, the emperor's efforts struggled. But political loyalties are rarely permanent, and within the warrior class, divisions emerged. Some samurai remained loyal to Kamakura. Others reconsidered their allegiance. Among those who changed the course of events, one figure stands out: Ashikaga Takauji. Originally aligned with the Kamakura government, Takauji ultimately turned against it. History often surprises us this way. Alliances shift, old loyalties weaken, and individuals reshape entire eras. By 1333, the Kamakura shogunate collapsed. The warrior government that had ruled for more than a century disappeared. Its fall marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of instability. Because victory creates new questions. Who now governs? Go-Daigo attempted imperial restoration. This period became known as the Meiji Restoration. His goal was bold: to restore direct imperial rule and reduce military dominance. Yet governing reality proved difficult. The warrior class had grown powerful. Military leaders expected influence, and tensions soon resurfaced. Ashikaga Takeuji eventually broke with Go-Daigo. Conflict returned, and from that struggle emerged another military government, the Ashikaga Shogunate, also called the Muromachi Shogunate, after the Kyoto district associated with its administration. Japan now entered a different warrior age. Unlike Kamakura, the Ashikaga system stood closer to the imperial court, geographically and culturally. Kyoto regained political importance. Art and religion flourished in many circles. Yet beneath refinement, authority often remained unstable. The Ashikaga shoguns possessed influence, but not always firm control over regional lords. And those regional lords, known as daimyo, grew increasingly powerful. Tonight, we should picture medieval Japan as a landscape of layered authority. The emperor, the shogun, the daimyo, temples and monasteries, warrior families. Power spread through many hands, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. And during the Muromachi era, culture continued evolving in beautiful ways. Zen Buddhism gained influence among samurai and intellectual circles. Its emphasis on discipline, meditation, and simplicity resonated deeply. Temple gardens appeared. Minimalist aesthetics matured. The quiet beauty of stone and moss. Tea culture developed further. Architecture and painting reflected calm restraint. Even amid political uncertainty, Japanese culture reached remarkable refinement. This contrast feels deeply human. History does not wait for peace before creating beauty. Art often blooms beside instability. Yet by the 15th century, cracks widened. Economic pressures, regional rivalries, weak central authority, and eventually a single conflict ignited something larger: the Onin War. Beginning in 1467, what started as succession and political dispute spiraled into devastation. Kyoto suffered heavily. Fighting spread, fires consumed districts, and the authority of the Ashikaga regime weakened dramatically. Tonight, imagine smoke rising above the capital, noble houses damaged, warriors choosing sides, and uncertainty spreading far beyond the city. The Onin War did not simply end neatly. Its consequences lingered, because after it, Japan entered a fragmented world, a time when daimyo ruled territories like competing kingdoms, a period of ambition, betrayal, and endless campaigns. History remembers it by a powerful name, the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States. And within this fractured landscape, some of Japan's most famous figures were about to emerge, men whose names still echo through history: warriors, strategists, unifiers. And among them, one would begin changing Japan through fire and relentless ambition. Oda Nobunaga was waiting in the shadows of chaos. The smoke of the Onin War had faded. But peace did not follow. Instead, Japan entered one of the most turbulent chapters in its long history. A fractured land, castles rising above hills, war banners moving across valleys, and rival lords competing beneath uncertain skies. Tonight, we enter the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. Despite the name, this was not one single war, nor one united struggle. It was a long period of shifting alliances and regional conflict that stretched across generations. Central authority weakened. The Ashikaga shogunate still existed, but its control had grown fragile. And as the center weakened, the provinces grew stronger. Across Japan, powerful regional lords, the daimyo, expanded their influence. Some inherited authority. Others seized it through force. Loyalty became practical rather than permanent. Alliances shifted. Neighbors became enemies. Enemies became allies. And survival required caution. Tonight, imagine the landscape of Sengoku, Japan. Hilltop castles watching over forests. Messengers riding narrow roads. Farmers uncertain which banner would appear next. And warriors preparing not for occasional conflict, but for generations of instability. Yet even amid warfare, Japanese society continued evolving. Technology changed. Agriculture improved. Trade expanded in some regions. And perhaps most unexpectedly, new visitors arrived from far beyond Asia. In 1543, Portuguese traders reached Japan. Their arrival introduced unfamiliar goods, new connections, and something that would alter warfare dramatically. Firearms, the matchlock gun. At first, such weapons appeared strange, but Japanese leaders learned quickly. Craftsmen reproduced and improved them, and within decades, firearms became increasingly important on battlefields. This mattered enormously because military power was changing. Traditional samurai combat still carried prestige. Archery, swordsmanship, mounted warfare. But organized infantry and gunpowder now reshaped strategy. The Sengoku world adapted, and in times of chaos, adaptation often determines survival. Christian missionaries also entered Japan during this period. Among the most famous was Francis Xavier. They brought Christianity alongside trade and diplomacy. Some daimyo welcomed these connections, partly from belief, partly from political and economic interest. The result was a surprisingly complex landscape. Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, Christian communities, foreign merchants, Japanese warlords negotiating opportunity and risk. This was not an isolated medieval world. Japan remained connected to broader currents of exchange. Yet the defining reality of Sengoku life remained conflict. And from conflict, extraordinary leaders emerged. Many daimyo sought power, but few possessed vision large enough to imagine something greater. Not merely victory over rivals, but the reunification of Japan itself. One such figure was born in 1534. At first, few would predict his future. He came from the province of Owari. He behaved unpredictably. Some considered him reckless, even eccentric. But history often hides ambition beneath unusual appearances. His name was Oda Nobunaga. Tonight, we meet not yet the conqueror, but the young daimyo. Nobunaga inherited leadership during unstable times. His position was uncertain. Rivals surrounded him, and survival alone demanded skill. Yet he possessed qualities that set him apart: boldness, strategic intelligence, and willingness to challenge convention. Where others followed tradition carefully, Nobunaga often moved decisively. He recognized the importance of firearms. He reorganized armies. And perhaps most importantly, he imagined a Japan beyond endless fragmentation. One moment announced his rise dramatically: the Battle of Okehazama in 1560. Nobunaga faced a stronger opponent, Imagawa Yoshimoto. By conventional logic, defeat seemed likely. The enemy possessed greater numbers, experience, confidence. Yet battle rarely obeys certainty. Using surprise and terrain, Nobunaga launched an unexpected attack. The result stunned contemporaries. Imagawa fell, and Nobunaga's reputation transformed almost overnight. The victory became legendary, not merely because of courage, but because it revealed strategic brilliance. After Okehazama, Nobunaga expanded steadily. Castles strengthened. Alliances formed. Enemies challenged him and often failed. Yet he was not gentle. History remembers Nobunaga as capable, visionary, and sometimes ruthless. He confronted powerful Buddhist military institutions, destroyed opposition, and pursued authority with relentless determination. To supporters, he represented order emerging from chaos. To enemies, he inspired fear. Such duality often surrounds transformative figures, and perhaps that is why they remain unforgettable. Tonight, Japan still lies divided. Many wars remain ahead. The dream of unification has not yet been fulfilled, but the direction of history is changing. The age of scattered warlords may not last forever, because Nobunaga's ambition would soon draw others into his orbit, men whose names still live beside his, and among them, one figure would continue the work after fate intervened. A man born from humble origins, patient, clever, and destined to complete what Nobunaga began. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was already watching history unfold. The winds of the Sengoku age still carried uncertainty. Castles watched over divided lands. Warriors pledged loyalty and sometimes broke it. And across Japan, countless lives unfolded beneath the shadow of conflict. Yet amid this fractured world, one man moved with unusual determination: Oda Nobunaga. His victories had begun reshaping political reality. But ambition alone does not change history. It must survive resistance. And resistance surrounded him. Tonight, we follow Nobunaga as his influence spread across central Japan. After the triumph at Okehazama, his reputation grew rapidly. Former rivals reconsidered alliances. Some joined him willingly. Others resisted. Nobunaga understood something essential about his age. Speed mattered. Adaptation mattered. But more centralized, more ordered, more governed. And still, history guards surprises, because power attracts danger. The greater Nobunaga's influence became, the more enemies gathered in shadow. In 1582, an unexpected betrayal shattered certainty. One of Nobunaga's own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned against him. The reasons remain debated: political disagreement, personal grievance, fear, ambition. History leaves room for speculation. What we know is this: Nobunaga found himself surrounded at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. The attack came suddenly, the situation hopeless. And there, amid flames and confusion, the man who had changed Japan's destiny met his end. His death shocked the country. The great unifier had fallen before completing his work, and for a moment, uncertainty returned. Would Japan fracture again? Would rivals erase his progress? Or had Nobunaga already changed history too deeply to be undone? Tonight, the answer waits nearby, and hesitation could prove fatal. He expanded carefully, yet aggressively. Castles became strategic centers of authority. Roads and trade routes gained importance, and military organization evolved. Perhaps nowhere did Nobunaga's innovation become clearer than in his use of firearms. Although guns had arrived through Portuguese contact, many leaders still treated them cautiously. Nobunaga saw their potential. He trained soldiers systematically, integrated firearms into battlefield tactics, and recognized that discipline could outweigh inherited prestige. The samurai world was changing. Honor remained important, but warfare increasingly depended on coordination and planning. One battle demonstrated this transformation dramatically: the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. Nobunaga and his ally, Tokugawa Ieyasu, faced the powerful Takeda clan. The Takeda cavalry carried fearsome reputation. Traditional mounted warfare remained highly respected. Yet Nobunaga prepared differently. Defensive barriers, organized infantry, rotating volleys of gunfire. The result proved devastating for the attackers. Though historians continue debating some details, Nagashino entered memory as a symbol of military transition. Old assumptions no longer guaranteed victory. Japan's battlefield had changed. But Nobunaga sought more than military success. He challenged political structures too. Among his fiercest struggles were conflicts with militant Buddhist institutions. Some temples had grown wealthy and militarized, controlling territory and armed followers. These communities were not merely religious centers, they were political actors. And Nobunaga viewed competing power cautiously. His campaigns against such institutions could be severe. One of the most controversial episodes involved Mount Hiei and the Enryaku-ji complex. The destruction carried terrible human cost, and even centuries later, it remains debated and mourned. History rarely offers simple heroes. Transformative rulers often leave complicated legacies. Nobunaga certainly did. He could encourage trade, support urban growth, reward talent. Yet he could also act with striking ruthlessness. Perhaps that tension explains why his memory remains powerful. He was not dreamlike legend alone. He was deeply human. Ambitious, imperfect, relentless. Meanwhile, Kyoto itself increasingly returned to political importance. Nobunaga entered the city and influenced imperial affairs. The weakened Ashikaga shogunate struggled to resist, and eventually, the final Ashikaga shogun lost authority. After more than 2 centuries, the Muromachi shogunate effectively ended. The old order had fallen. Japan remained ununified, but one obstacle after another disappeared before Nobunaga's advance. Tonight, imagine his castle at Azuchi. Not merely fortress, but statement. Its design reflected confidence and authority. Decorated interiors, commanding height, a symbol announcing new power. From such places, Nobunaga envisioned a different Japan. Perhaps not peaceful yet. Because among Nobunaga's followers stood a man unlike many aristocratic warlords, a leader whose beginnings were humble, whose rise seemed almost impossible, and whose patience concealed extraordinary political skill. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and where Nobunaga's story ended in fire, Hideyoshi's would continue through strategy. The fires of Honnoji had faded into memory. Smoke drifted away above Kyoto, and with the death of Oda Nobunaga, Japan once again stood at a crossroads. For years, Nobunaga had pushed against chaos. He had broken rivals, challenged old structures, and carried the dream of reunification through war and determination. But now he was gone, and history asked a familiar question: who continues the unfinished work? Tonight, we meet the man who answered, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Among Japan's great historical figures, Hideyoshi's rise remains extraordinary. Unlike many powerful daimyo, he was not born into ancient aristocracy. His origins were comparatively humble. The son of a peasant foot soldier, according to many accounts, and in a society shaped strongly by hierarchy, such beginnings mattered. Yet history occasionally allows unusual paths. Hideyoshi entered Nobunaga's service as a young man. At first, not as legendary commander, but as retainer, an observer, someone who learned carefully. And perhaps that ability to study people and circumstances became his greatest strength. Where Nobunaga often moved like sudden fire, Hideyoshi resembled flowing water, adaptable, patient, strategic. When news of Nobunaga's death spread in 1582, confusion threatened everything. Rival commanders hesitated, alliances trembled, and Akechi Mitsuhide, the betrayer of Honnoji, briefly believed opportunity had arrived. But Hideyoshi reacted swiftly, very swiftly. He negotiated temporary peace with enemies, moved forces rapidly, and confronted Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki. The conflict was brief. Mitsuhide fell, and with astonishing speed, Hideyoshi positioned himself as Nobunaga's political successor. Yet claiming succession and securing authority are different things. Many powerful lords remained. Japan was still divided, and Hideyoshi possessed neither imperial blood nor inherited supremacy. So he relied on what he understood best: alliance, calculation, and gradual consolidation. Tonight, imagine Japan during these years. Castles illuminated beneath night skies, messengers traveling dangerous roads, warriors measuring loyalty carefully. Every decision carried consequence. Hideyoshi proved remarkably skilled in this world. He defeated rivals, negotiated settlements, rewarded supporters, and expanded influence steadily. One important challenge came from Shibata Katsuie, another senior figure connected to Nobunaga's legacy. Conflict followed. Hideyoshi prevailed. Later, he confronted perhaps his greatest remaining rival, Tokugawa Ieyasu. At this stage, Ieyasu had not yet become the towering figure history would remember, but he was already formidable, careful, patient, and difficult to control. Their struggle produced tension and military confrontation. Yet, ultimately, diplomacy mattered as much as battle. The relationship settled into uneasy coexistence, and once again, Hideyoshi advanced. By the late 1580s, Japan approached reunification. For generations, war had fragmented the islands. Now, for the first time in centuries, one authority neared dominance. Hideyoshi understood that military victory alone would not secure order. Society itself required structure, and so he introduced reforms. Land surveys measured agricultural production. Tax systems became more organized. Administration strengthened. One famous policy sought to separate warriors from peasants more clearly: the sword hunt. Weapons were collected from farming populations. Its purpose was practical and political: to reduce rebellion, to reinforce social order, and to define roles more rigidly. Samurai fought. Peasants farmed. Hierarchy became clearer. The result was not complete equality or freedom. Far from it. But it reflected Hideyoshi's vision of stability. Meanwhile, castle towns expanded. Trade flourished in many regions, and Japan slowly emerged from prolonged disorder. Yet, perhaps the most visible symbol of Hideyoshi's confidence stood in Osaka. Osaka Castle. Tonight, imagine it rising above the landscape. Massive stone foundations, golden decoration, layered towers reflecting authority and ambition. More than fortress, it was declaration. Japan had changed, and Hideyoshi stood at its center. But history often reveals a quiet truth. Leaders who unify nations sometimes seek purpose beyond unification itself. Once internal rivals diminish, attention may turn outward. Hideyoshi began imagining expansion beyond Japan. His ambitions reached toward the Asian mainland, toward Korea, and perhaps, ultimately, China. The campaigns that followed proved costly and difficult. Japanese forces invaded Korea beginning in 1592. Initial advances occurred, but resistance strengthened, logistics faltered, and the wars became exhausting for all involved. Korean defenders fought fiercely. Chinese intervention complicated matters further, and the dream of overseas conquest slowly weakened. These invasions left deep historical memory across the region, and they remind us that ambition, however powerful, does not guarantee success. Meanwhile, another issue troubled Hideyoshi: succession. He had achieved extraordinary authority, but who would preserve it? He possessed a young heir, too young to govern securely, and powerful daimyo still watched events carefully. Among them, the patient Tokugawa Ieyasu remained, watching, waiting. History sometimes belongs not only to those who rise quickly, but to those who endure. In 1598, Hideyoshi died, and with his death, uncertainty returned once more. Japan stood reunified, yet not fully settled. The dream of one Japan existed, but its future remained fragile. And now, two paths lay ahead: renewed conflict or lasting peace. The decision would emerge on a battlefield whose name still echoes across Japanese history: Sekigahara. And upon that field, the final great unifier would rise. The dream of one Japan had survived fire and war and generations of ambition. Yet after the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, certainty weakened once more. His young son remained too inexperienced to rule securely. Powerful daimyo measured one another carefully. Alliances shifted beneath polite words and ceremonial loyalty. And across the islands, people wondered quietly whether peace would endure or disappear again. Tonight, we arrive at one of the most decisive turning points in Japanese history: the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Among the great figures of the age, Ieyasu possessed a different temperament from Nobunaga or Hideyoshi. He was not sudden fire, nor endlessly adaptive water. He resembled something steadier, a mountain wading through changing weather, patient, cautious, and extraordinarily disciplined. Born in 1543, Ieyasu had spent much of his life navigating uncertainty. As a child, he experienced hostage politics. As a daimyo, he survived alliances and betrayals. He learned to endure, and endurance can become power. After Hideyoshi's death, tensions gathered around competing factions. Some remained loyal to the Toyotomi house, others aligned increasingly with Ieyasu. At first, conflict moved through diplomacy and suspicion, but suspicion often becomes confrontation. And by 1600, Japan approached another great battle. The field was Sekigahara. Tonight, imagine dawn breaking over mist-covered hills, thousands of warriors waiting, armor reflecting pale light, banners rising above morning fog, and beneath outward discipline, uncertainty. The Battle of Sekigahara was not merely military contest, it was a struggle over Japan's future. Who governs? What political order survives? Which alliances endure? Ieyasu commanded one coalition, his opponents another. The scale was immense for the period, and as fighting unfolded, loyalty proved as important as strength. Some commanders changed sides, others hesitated. Battlefields often turn not on numbers alone, but on decisions made in moments of doubt. By day's end, Ieyasu emerged victorious. The consequences were enormous. Sekigahara did not simply decide one succession dispute, it established the foundation of a new age. 3 years later, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu received the title of shogun, and with it, the Tokugawa shogunate began. Its government centered in Edo, the city we now know as Tokyo. At the time, Edo was far smaller than Kyoto, yet under Tokugawa leadership, it would grow into one of the world's great cities. The Tokugawa system differed from earlier shogunates. Its leaders had learned from centuries of instability. They understood that military victory alone could not guarantee peace. Control required structure. And so, governance became carefully organized. The emperor remained in Kyoto, his sacred status preserved, but practical authority rested with the shogunate. Daimyo retained domains, yet their independence narrowed. One particularly effective system required many daimyo to spend alternating periods in Edo. This policy, known as Sankin Kotai, served several purposes. It encouraged loyalty, limited rebellion, and quietly transformed travel and infrastructure. Road networks improved, castle towns prospered, economic life expanded. Peace, surprisingly, can reshape landscapes as profoundly as war. Tonight, Edo begins to grow around us. Wooden streets, bridges crossing canals, merchants carrying goods, samurai serving administrators rather than preparing constantly for battle. For the first time in centuries, prolonged internal peace emerged. This era would last more than 250 years, the Edo period. Yet peace brought its own transformations. The samurai class still held prestige. They wore swords, occupied respected status, and remained tied to ideals of loyalty and discipline. But many now lived not as battlefield warriors, but as bureaucrats and officials. History had altered their role, and perhaps this is one of its quiet lessons. Even powerful traditions evolve. Society during Tokugawa rule became highly structured. Classes were more clearly defined. Samurai, farmers, artisans, merchants. Movement between groups remained limited. Order mattered greatly. Sometimes stability carries comfort, sometimes constraint. Often, both. Meanwhile, foreign relations changed dramatically. European trade and Christianity had entered Japan during earlier centuries. Yet Tokugawa leaders viewed outside influence cautiously, especially after observing religious and political tensions linked to missionary activity. Gradually, restrictions increased, and eventually, Japan entered a policy later described as sakoku, often translated as closed country. The phrase can sound absolute, though reality proved more nuanced. Japan was not completely sealed from the world. Trade continued through carefully controlled channels, especially with Dutch and Chinese merchants at Nagasaki. But foreign contact narrowed significantly. For many generations, the islands looked inward. And inward-looking societies often produce unique cultural worlds. The age of battle had quieted, but something equally influential was beginning. An age not defined by conquest, but by culture. Tea houses, theater, woodblock prints, poetry, and the beauty of everyday life. The Japan many people imagine today was beginning to take shape in the peace of Tokugawa Edo. The battlefields had grown quieter. For generations, war banners had crossed valleys and mountain roads. But under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan entered an age few earlier rulers could have imagined. Long peace, not perfect peace, not equal peace, but peace sustained across centuries. Tonight, we wander through the world of Edo, Japan, a world often remembered for beauty. And perhaps beauty flourishes most noticeably after long hardship. The city of Edo expanded with remarkable speed. What had once been modest settlement gradually transformed into one of the largest urban centers on Earth. Wooden neighborhoods spread outward, markets thrived, canals carried movement and trade, and beneath lantern light, millions of ordinary lives unfolded. This Japan was carefully ordered. The Tokugawa government valued stability deeply. Society followed formal hierarchy. At the top stood the shogunate and daimyo. Below them, the samurai class. Then farmers, artisans, and merchants. Yet history enjoys quiet irony. Though merchants ranked lower officially, many accumulated considerable wealth. Commerce expanded, cities prospered, and economic life grew increasingly dynamic. Tonight, imagine walking through Edo after sunset. Paper lanterns glowing softly, shopkeepers arranging goods, street performers entertaining passers-by, the scent of food drifting through narrow streets, and beyond political structures, a rich urban culture emerging. The samurai themselves experienced changing identities. Their ancestors had lived by warfare, but peace transformed responsibility. Many served as administrators and officials. They studied law, governance, literature, and philosophy. The sword remained symbolically important, yet daily life often involved paperwork rather than battle. Some adapted successfully, others struggled with changing purpose. History does this repeatedly. Roles that once defined society evolve, and people must evolve with them. Meanwhile, intellectual and spiritual life deepened. Confucian thought influenced governance and ethics, duty, order, respect. Education carried growing importance. At the same time, Zen Buddhism continued shaping aesthetics and discipline. Its quiet influence appeared not only in monasteries, but in gardens, art, and ways of seeing the world. The Japanese tea ceremony matured into refined practice, not hurried refreshment, but mindful ritual. Movements measured carefully, utensils selected thoughtfully, silence carrying meaning. The ceremony reflected broader cultural values, attention, balance, and awareness of the present moment. Gardens, too, became philosophical spaces, raked gravel, moss, stone, water, not attempts to dominate nature, but to cooperate with it. Even emptiness gained significance. This aesthetic sensitivity shaped many arts of the Edo world, and among these arts, one became especially famous: ukiyo-e, woodblock prints. The term often translates as pictures of the floating world. These prints depicted actors, landscapes, courtesans, travel scenes, and moments of ordinary life. Affordable and widely distributed, they carried art beyond aristocratic circles. Tonight, imagine craftsmen carving wooden blocks with patient precision, ink pressed carefully onto paper, color emerging layer by layer. The results could be astonishing. One artist in particular remains celebrated worldwide: Katsushika Hokusai. His image, the Great Wave, became iconic far beyond Japan. A towering wave, small boats, and distant Mount Fuji standing quietly beneath uncertainty. The image feels almost symbolic of Japanese history itself: nature, fragility, endurance. Theater flourished as well. Kabuki performances attracted lively audiences. Stylized movement, music, drama. Meanwhile, Bunraku puppet theater demonstrated extraordinary artistry. Stories of love, loyalty, sacrifice, and tragedy moved audiences deeply. The Edo world was not culturally silent. It was vibrant, creative, and surprisingly sophisticated. Yet beneath stability, restrictions remained. The Tokugawa order controlled movement and political expression carefully. Christianity faced severe suppression after earlier tensions and uprisings. Foreign contact remained limited, and while peace endured, so too did hierarchy and regulation. Still, from the perspective of many contemporary societies, Tokugawa Japan enjoyed remarkable continuity. Generations grew up without nationwide civil war. Roads improved, agriculture advanced, literacy rates rose. Travel for pilgrimage and commerce expanded. People increasingly imagined themselves not merely as residents of local domains, but as participants in a wider Japanese world. And perhaps this growing shared identity mattered more than rulers fully realized, because history beyond the islands was changing again. Far across oceans, industrial powers expanded. Steamships crossed seas, empires reached outward, and technologies transformed warfare and trade. For centuries, Japan had looked inward, protected by policy and geography. But the 19th century would bring pressure impossible to ignore. The sea that once shielded Japan would soon carry unfamiliar ships to its shores, and with them a challenge unlike any before. The quiet Edo world was approaching its final dawn. For more than 2 centuries, the Tokugawa world had endured. Seasons passed over rice fields and castle towns. Merchants traded beneath lantern light. Tea houses welcomed conversation, and the rhythm of Japanese life moved with remarkable continuity. But history beyond the islands had not remained still. Across Europe and the Americas, industrial power accelerated. Steam engines transformed transport. Factories altered economies, and nations increasingly projected influence across oceans. Tonight, the sea surrounding Japan changes once again, not with Mongol fleets, but with smoke and iron. The year was 1853. Off the coast of Japan, Unfamiliar vessels appeared, dark ships driven by steam, their silhouettes unsettling against the horizon. The Japanese called them the Black Ships. They belonged to the United States Navy, commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry. Perry carried diplomatic demands. His mission was clear. Japan should open relations and ports to American trade. To modern audiences, diplomacy may sound routine, but for Tokugawa Japan, the moment felt deeply unsettling. For generations, foreign contact had remained tightly controlled. The outside world existed, yet at careful distance. Now, powerful industrial states approached directly, and their technology revealed uncomfortable realities. Steam-powered warships, modern artillery, global naval reach. The Tokugawa government faced difficult choices: resist or negotiate. Neither path felt simple. Some argued Japan should preserve tradition and reject outside pressure. Others believed adaptation had become necessary. The debate was not merely political, it touched identity itself. What does a society protect when the world changes? And what must it transform to survive? Eventually, treaties opened limited contact. The Convention of Kanagawa in 1854 marked an important beginning, but compromise brought controversy. Many criticized the shogunate. Its authority weakened, and once again, Japan entered uncertainty. The old order no longer seemed permanent. Across the country, powerful slogans emerged. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Emotion and politics intertwined. Some domains supported reform, others defended tradition, and beneath the tension, another possibility quietly strengthened. Perhaps Japan required not restoration of the past, but reinvention. The emperor, long politically distant in Kyoto, returned to national attention. For centuries, imperial authority had remained symbolic. Now it became politically powerful once more. Conflict followed. The final years of Tokugawa rule proved turbulent, and in 1868, a transformation began whose consequences still shape Japan today: the Meiji Restoration. The word restoration suggests return, yet the Meiji era became something more revolutionary than restorative. Power shifted, the Tokugawa shogunate ended, and authority reorganized around the emperor. The young ruler associated with this age became known as Emperor Meiji. Tonight, we should picture Japan standing between worlds. Behind it, samurai domains, castle governments, centuries of managed isolation. Ahead, railways, industry, factories, and rapid change. The Meiji leadership studied foreign systems intensely, not from surrender, but from urgency. They understood a dangerous truth. Many Asian societies faced colonial pressure during this age, and Japan wished to avoid subjugation. Modernization became strategy. Schools expanded, infrastructure developed, railroads appeared, telegraph lines connected regions. Western military organization influenced reform. And perhaps most dramatically, the samurai order itself changed. For generations, samurai had defined political and military identity. Now, hereditary privilege weakened. Sword-wearing lost official exclusivity. a modern national army emerged. Some welcomed reform, others mourned loss, because transformation always carries emotional cost. One symbolic resistance appeared in the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. Led by Saigo Takamori, later romanticized as the Last Samurai, the uprising reflected tensions between old values and new realities. The rebellion failed, and with it, the samurai age effectively closed. Yet modernization continued. Factories multiplied, universities developed, cities expanded, and astonishingly quickly, Japan emerged as industrial power. This transformation surprised much of the world. A nation once perceived as isolated and traditional now adopted technology and institutions at remarkable speed. But modernization also altered ambition. Industrial states often seek influence, and Japan increasingly joined global competition. Wars followed. Victory against China in 1895, and even more shocking to contemporary observers, victory against Russia in 1905. For the first time in the modern era, an Asian power defeated a major European empire in large-scale war. The psychological impact was enormous. Japan now stood not at the margins of world politics, but near its center. Yet power brings consequence. The 20th century would test Japan profoundly. Empire, conflict, nationalism, and eventually devastation on a scale difficult to imagine. The islands had modernized with extraordinary speed, but modernity itself carried shadows, and soon Japan would enter the most turbulent century of its history. The world moved faster now. Railways crossed landscapes. Factories reshaped cities. And the Japan that had once watched foreign ships with uncertainty had become a modern nation with growing confidence. Yet history carries a difficult truth. Periods of rapid strength and ambition can also lead toward dangerous roads. Tonight, we enter the final chapter of our long journey. A century of triumph, loss, and renewal. The early 20th century brought profound change. Japan had modernized with remarkable speed. Its military expanded, its industries grew, and its leaders increasingly viewed the nation as a major power within a competitive world. Across many countries during this era, nationalism strengthened. Empires competed, resources mattered, and political tensions stretched across continents. Japan was not separate from these currents. It was deeply involved within them. Victories in earlier wars had increased prestige. Territories expanded. Influence widened. And many believed the nation's future depended upon continued strength abroad. Yet power is rarely simple. Economic pressures, international rivalries, and political divisions complicated the years ahead. The world itself seemed uneasy, and eventually that unease erupted. The Second World War became the defining catastrophe of the century. Tonight, we approach this history carefully, because behind military events and political decisions, there were millions of ordinary lives, families, children, workers, people hoping simply to endure uncertain days. Japan's wartime experience brought immense hardship. Conflict spread across Asia and the Pacific. Resources grew strained. Cities faced destruction, and fear became familiar companion to many households. The war reshaped countless lives beyond the battlefield. Then came 1945, a year carrying enormous weight in human memory. The war reached its devastating conclusion, and two cities entered history forever: Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction caused by atomic bombing remains among the most painful chapters of modern history. Loss touched families and generations, and even now, remembrance continues with solemn reflection. Soon afterward, Japan surrendered. The war ended, and silence followed. Not peaceful silence at first, but the heavy stillness that sometimes arrives after unimaginable upheaval. For a country whose history stretched through emperors, samurai, and centuries of continuity, defeat brought profound uncertainty. What comes after devastation? How does a nation rebuild identity when familiar structures have fallen? These questions shaped post-war Japan. Occupation authorities introduced reforms. Political systems changed. A new constitution emerged, and Japan gradually redirected its energy, not toward military expansion, but toward reconstruction. Tonight, we should imagine the quiet courage involved in rebuilding. Streets repaired, homes reconstructed, factories reopened, schools welcoming children again. History often remembers battles loudly, but rebuilding deserves memory too, because it asks for endurance of a different kind. And Japan endured. The decades following the war became extraordinary. Industry accelerated. Technology advanced. Economic growth transformed daily life. Cities expanded upward with light and movement. Companies gained international influence. And by the late 20th century, Japan had become one of the world's leading economies. Products marked "Made in Japan" traveled globally. Automobiles, electronics, innovation. The nation that once feared foreign steamships now helped shape modern technology itself. Yet, alongside modern achievement, something older remained. This may be one of Japan's most remarkable qualities: the coexistence of past and present. Tonight, imagine modern Japan carefully. High-speed trains gliding between cities, neon reflections across Tokyo's streets, and nearby, quiet shrines beneath cedar trees. Ancient festivals still celebrated. Tea ceremonies continuing. Seasonal traditions preserved. The old world did not vanish entirely. It adapted. Cherry blossoms still return each spring. Temple bells still sound. And Mount Fuji still watches from the horizon, as it did long before written history remembered these islands. Modern Japan faces its own challenges: economic questions, natural disasters, changing demographics, and the complexities of an interconnected world. No nation escapes difficulty. History never truly ends. It only changes form. And perhaps, after traveling together from volcanic origins to the present day, we can see Japan not merely as samurai and castles, nor only as technology and cities, but as something more layered, an island story shaped by nature, belief, beauty, discipline, conflict, and resilience. We began tonight before there was even a nation called Japan, only forests, mountains, and drifting mist above the sea. Then came villages, queens, courts, warriors, shoguns, poets, reformers, and generations of ordinary people whose names history never fully recorded, yet whose lives built the world that followed. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden inside long history. Countries are not born complete. They are carried forward by countless lives, each leaving small traces behind. And now, our journey nears its end. If you are still awake here with us at Silent Kingdoms, thank you for traveling through centuries beneath this quiet night sky. Tell us gently in the comments where you listened from and what hour the night has reached in your corner of the world. And if these peaceful journeys through history help bring rest or comfort, your support carries Silent Kingdoms a little closer toward our first 1,000 companions. For now, the lanterns grow dim, the waves continue touching distant shores, and somewhere across Japan, night settles softly beneath the shadow of mountains. Rest well, and until our next journey, good night.